Okay, so questions, we'll have time for a very few. Nisha, okay, go on, Pawan. After him.
First of all, thank
Yes.
you for a fascinating talk. I
Yes.
really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question is that the lessons learned from all these things, it's very illuminating and very interesting. Uh, Ultimately, it would be always very interesting also to map this to human behavior.
Yes,
And
I
if
agree.
you may want to just comment on this, to what extent are we close to or far away from it?
Different kinds of possibilities. On the one hand, there's very clear, very straightforward, non-controversial ways in which we can learn from these insects and do things. So, for example, there's a whole branch of computer science which is inspired by ant behavior. There's an ant colony optimization. I think there's a whole books on this, the whole field of this. So, computer scientists have learned a great deal from how communication happens in social insects, and they're doing that. The France telecom industry hires ant specialists to tell them how to route their telephone calls. Internet people are using this. There are many such applications which are being used. Robotists are interested in this. So there is direct advantage. Now, that is non-controversial. What is controversial is, can we learn something for humans? Now, here I'll tell you what my position is. Different people have different positions. My position is as follows. That's actually how I end a different talk where I talk more about the biology here at home. So I end my talk on biology with the following statement. I say that we cannot imitate nature. We should not imitate nature, insects or anybody else. But we can use them as a mirror to understand ourselves better. So they help us to understand ourselves better. Why do we behave in this fashion? Why is there conflict in the situation? And then we decide what we want to do. But I am willing to say that they are extremely useful as mirrors to understand ourselves better. But I am very clear in my mind that we should not imitate, because ought is not equal to is. What is in nature is not necessarily good. In fact, in nature there is everything, good, bad and ugly. I can give you example of anything. So we can't, there is no way of imitating nature, but we can learn a great deal and understand ourselves better. In fact, when I give the biology talk, I always begin by saying, why do I study social insects? For the same reasons that an anthropologist studies human societies. Why do you go and study an exotics, so human tribe in Andamans? Not because you want to copy them, but you want to understand yourself. So if human tribes can be used to understand yourself, biologists have the whole animal kingdom, and those of us who study insects can harness wisdom from an altogether sub-kingdom of life. So it is really to understand ourselves, not to imitate. But when we know what we want to do, we can learn from them. If you want to route your telephone calls properly, you can learn from them. If you want to increase the speed of your internet, you can learn from them. If you want to learn how to organize labor in a factory, you can learn from them.
Okay, we have time for two more questions, Nishad, and that's.
Yes.
When you say that use sociality has evolved 12 times and you try to use
Yes.
these ways to explain
Yes.
why,
Yes.
does this really tell you about why it's been maintained once it's evolved, or does it tell you why it's evolved?
When you count, it only tells you how many times it has evolved. Sure. It doesn't even tell you why. It only is a number. So basically, you look at the tree of life and you look at what branch point there was no use sociality and there is use sociality. So you count. So basically, now you know what groups to study to understand why it has evolved. Now, very often those groups are not there anymore. That is why I study a species like this, which today is capable of being solitary as well as social. And the transitions we see today, that is why these kinds of species are useful to look at how the transition happens. Now, why it is maintained, it's much more interesting to look at honeybees and ants, where they are highly evolved and they are not going backwards. So there's a whole group of people trying to understand why advanced use sociality is irreversible. Because you cross so many bridges and you sort of, metaphorically speaking, you burn the bridges as you go, so you can't go back. So there's a whole subset of our field which is trying to understand why it is irreversible. I am much more interested in knowing what is the initial step that makes you make this transition. But I can only study today's species.
No, so I guess what I meant was, so you showed us this distribution of 95% and 5%, right? But that should be contingent then on what the demographic factors are. So in principle, that could be exactly reversed if, let's say, the survival of whatever solitary wasps was influenced, etc. Right? Or so.
No, but these 12 cases have maintained. They have not lost.
Sure.
They have not lost. We do not know a single case of loss once the sociality becomes advanced. In the primitive stage, there are any number of examples of gain and loss. In fact, some people claim there are hundreds of gains and losses in the early stages. But once you reach a certain stage, there is no documentation of loss. In fact, I am trying to make a case that it can be lost. Nobody believes me yet, but I am trying to build an idea that in principle it can be lost, and when it can be lost, and how we can detect signals of loss. This is one of my pet subjects.
Last question, please.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, can it happen, for example, that the children of a particular father are stronger and more efficient, and even though the relatedness is somewhat less, the colony or some fraction of the colony may prefer to raise these?
Absolutely. In fact, I think those things are more, and those things have been neglected because it's related to such an attractive thing that you just measure it and you say. But I think those are more important. So consider, for example, in a colony, suddenly a very, very strong individual is born. The other should make way for her to become the next queen. And we find evidence of these kinds of things. So that's why my point is ecological, demographic, physiological factors should be investigated, not just relatedness. And somehow our community is sold on relatedness. Everybody measures relatedness. In fact, they fly off thousands of kilometers, go to some jungle, collect some wasps, bring them home, grind them, and look at their DNA. They don't know what those wasps do. Whereas what we have been doing is for 40 years we sit in the field under the sun and mark thousands of wasps and watch what they are doing long before we grind them up and make their DNA. So I completely agree with you, and I think more and more people should do that.
It's merit versus nepotism.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Handing back to Sutit. So if there are more questions, please stay back. We can, you're most welcome to engage with the speaker right after the thing. We just have to close this, the auditorium. That's why we are stopping this. But please do feel free to ask more questions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope all of you will appreciate my starting comments about Professor Gadagkar being inspirational for evolutionary biologists in India. There is a reason for which it has happened. So, I mean, as he announced right at the beginning, he has always been very kind to us. He has always graced us on multiple occasions. And we know he likes this place, but we want to give him a small memento so that he can remember this particular colloquium occasion. Give me a minute. Yeah. We thought that the talk and this particular memento will go together. This is actually...
Wondering why a human is looking for stupid.
Yeah, this is a very famous statue by a guy called Reinhold. It's called the Reinhold monkey. So it's an official reproduction of the statue.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll close the event now. And as Hari said, if anybody has any questions, please feel to hang back outside. We have to close the auditorium. Thank you.